Hello again, gang. Glad you're here as we circle in for the conclusion of Luke's Gospel. Also, we have some interesting questions this week. We'll start out again in Luke. Luke 23 forms something of a transition because it's at this point that they take Jesus from the Jewish leadership and take him to Romans. In chapter 22, verse 67, the priests and the scribes asked Jesus, "Are you the Christ? Tell us." He said to them, "If I tell you, you won't believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer me, nor will you let me go. From sometime in the future, you're going to see the Son of Man sit on the right hand and the power of God." And then they all said, "Are you the Son of God?" He said to them, "You are right in saying I am." Now, there's a certain ambiguity in the Greek at this point. King James says, "Thou sayest." Some people have taken that as an avoidance of the answer. The NIV says, no, he just said, "You're right in saying that I am the Son of God." And they said, "Why do we need any more witnesses? We have heard it out of his own mouth." Obviously, this last was condemned in that they saw it as an admission that he was claiming to be divine. It's fascinating in that there are those who say Jesus is not God, but the Son of God. Now, to the Jews, that's just mere semantics because he stepped over a line in their eyes when they did that. So having come to the conclusion that he was a blasphemer, they took him and led him to Pilate. Luke 23, verse 1. Began to accuse him, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation." Really? Perverting the nation? And forbidding to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he himself is Christ the King. Now you hear this, you groan within yourself at the lie of this. It is so reminiscent of the talking points of modern political debate. You watch these people and you wonder that their nose isn't getting longer as they talk. One of the advantages of television would be you should be able to see that, but you can see, if you're watching for it and you know what you're listening for, you can see that they know what they're doing. They are deliberately distorting what someone else said. That's what they're doing with Jesus. Jesus never said not to give tribute to Caesar. He said, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, the things that are God's to God." It was a lie. That he said he himself was Christ the King? One wonders if they ever heard him say that, but that they plainly thought that was the claim. No one, it seems, cares about the truth. They only care about advancing their objectives, and too many people will fudge the truth to get where they want to go. So Pilate asked Jesus, "Are you the King of the Jews?" "Yes, it is as you say," Jesus replied. Now, remarkably, Pilate didn't think much of this, and he didn't buy the argument about taxes either. It's neither here nor there that Jesus is going out there complaining about taxes. My word, folks, if we can jail people for complaining about taxes in our country, there aren't enough jails to hold us all. So he didn't think much about it. And so he said to the chief priests and the people, "I don't find any fault in this man." And they were the more fierce, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Jewry, beginning from Galilee right down to here." Now when Pilate heard the word Galilee, he thought he could see himself a glimmer of light of getting out of the situation. So he asked, "Is this guy a Galilean?" As soon as he knew that he belonged in Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who also himself was in Jerusalem at that time. So they had to take him across the street to where Herod was. The whole picture is one of Pilate's frustration with the Jewish leadership. He just wanted to get back to his breakfast, and he did not want to have to deal with this. Now here's a side question. Some time ago I read a book called Jesus, the Jewish Theologian, I think by Brad Young. And it was a good book. There was much in it to compliment, but he has a chapter section in there where he is asking the question about who was really responsible for the death of Jesus. Was it the Jews or was it the Romans? And he turns himself inside out in trying to say, "Oh, no, the Jews weren't to blame. It was the Romans who did this evil deed." Oh, really? Well, I don't think Luke could have been any clearer in the way he writes through this story. Now, the problem is that down through history, Jews have been called Christ killers. And therefore, somebody who is a Jew in the 20th century might be in the eyes of somebody who is a Christian as responsible for the death of Christ. Get over it, folks. Just because some Jews were involved in the crucifixion of Jesus Christ did not taint the entire Jewish race at that time, and it certainly says nothing about Jews that are born today in our country. Now the question is, who killed Jesus? Who was responsible for his death? Well, he decided to ship him off at that time to Herod. Well, Herod, when he saw Jesus, was exceedingly glad. He was excited because he had been wanting to see him for a long time. He had heard a lot about Jesus, and he hoped to have seen some miracle done by him. He wasn't a total unbeliever. He would have been pleased to see it. And he questioned Jesus in many words, and Jesus wouldn't answer. And the chief priests and scribes stood and vehemently accused him. Vehemently. Not just mildly. Furiously. You know, when you really think your way through this, and you remember what Jesus said about they hated me without a cause. If they've hated me, they hated my Father before me. And this incredible hatred of God that just sticks in the craw of so many human beings, you see it today. You see it in the books that atheists are writing. You see it in a society that seems to be determined to ban God from our midst. They hate him. They fear him, yes, but that fear leads not to humility and conversion. It leads to hatred. You know, when you see what these men, not all Jews, because every one of Jesus' disciples was a Jew, when you see what the chief priests, not even all the priests, just this one cadre of priests and sages, that is the scribes, who were sort of the theologians of the time, who stood and vehemently accused Jesus and lied about it in the process. Can you wonder why God allowed these men to lose everything in 70 AD? Sometimes justice is a long time coming, but it does come. No question about it. Well, Herod and his soldiers set Jesus off and humiliated him and mocked him, and they put a really gorgeous robe on him and sent him again to Pilate, sent him back. The same day, Pilate and Herod were made friends again. They'd been enemies up until this point. All of this is a part of what Jesus endured on our behalf. He was tempted just as we are, without sin. He was suffered in the body, just as we do. He was tormented by enemies, just as many of us are from time to time. He was betrayed by a close friend. And I'm afraid it's a rare person that gets through this life without that happening to us somewhere along the line. Jesus endured it all. Pilate called together the chief priests and the rulers and the people. He said, "You brought this man to me as one that perverts the people, and I've examined him in front of you and have found no fault in this man touching the things you're accusing him of. Even Herod didn't find anything because I sent him over here, and nothing worthy of death is done by this man. I'm therefore going to chastise him and release him." Of necessity, he had to release one unto them at the feast. It was a long-standing custom. Oh, okay. Who was responsible for Jesus' death? The Roman decision was to chastise him and let him go. The chastisement is a warning for causing trouble for Pilate as much as anything else. They cried out all at once and said, "Away with this man. Release unto us Barabbas, who for a certain sedition made in the city, and for murder was cast into prison." If you're going to release somebody, as you always do at the feast, we want this murderer turned loose, and we want Jesus taken away. Pilate, therefore, willing to release Jesus, tried again. Now, who was responsible for Jesus' death? It's a libel to blame the Romans for it. It's a libel to say they were the ones that keyed all this up and teed it up and had Jesus killed. They were going to let him go. Their chief man was going to let him go. They cried out, these people, saying, "No, no, crucify him, crucify him." And he said the third time, "Why? What evil has he done? I find no cause of death in him. I will chastise him and let him go. And they were instant with loud voices, requiring that he might be crucified. No, not just taken out and hit with a sword. Crucified, the cruelest death known to man at the time. And the voices of them and the chief priests prevailed. Pilate, his job was to kind of keep the peace, and so he gave in and gave sentence that it should be as they required. And he released them to them, him unto them that for sedition and murder were cast into prison, and delivered Jesus to their will. None of this is to say that the Jews killed Christ. It was the temple elite at that time, the religious establishment of Judaism that hated him and wanted him dead and prevailed and got him dead. The Romans cared little for justice and less for life. They just had to keep the peace. They wanted this thing to go away. And Pilate gave in. I think Pilate, when it all comes down to it, might find forgiveness from God more readily than those men who screamed and wanted a murderer let go and the Son of God killed. As they led him away, they laid hold upon Simon, a Cyrenian coming out of the country, and they laid on him the cross that he might bear it after Jesus. And there followed him a great company of people and of women who were bewailing and lamenting him. But, he'd healed people's sons and daughters, and he'd healed some of them perhaps, and they listened to him, and they loved his teaching, and they were bewailing what was about to happen. And Jesus turned and said, Daughters of Jerusalem, weep not for me, weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are coming in which they shall say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bare and the paps which never gave suck. They're going to begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, to the hills, cover us. Because if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry? Basically, what he's doing is looking ahead another 30 years or so, 30 to 40 years, to the time when the Romans would come into that country and destroy it, tear down the temple. And they say that it was so desolate when the Romans got through that you could walk through that area as a passerby and never even know that a city had been there. It was that bad. There were 2 other criminals led with him to be put to death. When they got to the place called Calvary, they crucified him. Malefactors one on the right hand, the other on the left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. I think Jesus said this about the soldiers who carried out the act. They were doing their duty. They gave it instructions. They just went out and did what they were told to do. It wasn't their fault, not their doing. They parted his raiment and cast lots, and the people stood watching. The rulers also standing there derided him, saying, He saved others, let himself save himself, if he be the Christ, the chosen of God. And the soldiers also mocked him and came to him and offered him vinegar, saying, You're the king of the Jews, save yourself. The rulers of the people derided him, not the people. The ordinary people were crying, the women were weeping. They were, bewailing what was about to happen to him. Their rulers made fun of him. A superscription was written over him in letters of Greek and Latin and Hebrew, This is the King of the Jews. And one of the malefactors hanged with him said, If you're the Christ, save yourself and us. And the other thief, answering, rebuked him, Are you not afraid of God, seeing you're right here in the same condemnation? We deserve it. We receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he turned and he said to Lord Jesus, Remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus said to him, Verily I say unto you, today you shall be with me in paradise. Now there's some really odd arguments that arise out of this statement of of Jesus to the thief. Well, where was Jesus that day? Today, this day? He was on the stake. Was that paradise? Hardly. Where was he that night? He was in the tomb. Was that paradise? No. I don't find anything at all to say that Jesus was in paradise until his final ascension some 30 days later. Today, the word today modifies what he is saying, not the being in paradise. What Jesus is saying, as of today, as of now, you're going to be with me in paradise in the future. It is just a form of emphasis, like me saying to you, I'm going to tell you right now what's going to happen. There's nothing there about the idea that somehow the two of them are going to be in paradise because Jesus would be dead. Some doctrinal statements have Jesus going down into hell and preaching to the spirits in prison. That's not paradise either. In fact, there's nothing to say anything like that ever happened. Well, it was the 6th hour, and there came darkness over all the earth until the 9th hour. 3 hours. It was dark. The sun was darkened, and the veil of the temple ripped right down the middle. And when Jesus cried with a loud voice, he said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. And having said this, he gave up the ghost. The veil was rent in the temple. What he's talking about here is that in the temple there was an area called the holy place. If you visualize a rectangle and a cube, that's basically what you have in the temple. The Holy of Holies was a cube. It was square in its area and of course the same height as well. And that was where the ark was, when there was an ark. By this time there was not one there. But it was the Holy of Holies, and the high priest sprinkled blood in that place even so. On the outside of it, in the rectangular room, this was the holy place. There was an altar, and the altar of incense was between it and the Holy of Holies, where they carried on their duties. The veil between these two, according to Paul, was a symbol of the barrier between man and God, and that when Jesus died, the veil between man and God was torn apart, and man was given access that he had never had before. The NIV says, when Jesus had said this, he breathed his last. Gave up the ghost has entered our language from the King James Version, but that's not what the Greek says. It basically just simply says he stopped breathing. Now, when the centurion, the Roman, in charge of all this stuff, saw the land go dark, and when he saw what happened here, he glorified God, saying, certainly this was a righteous man. And all the people that came together to that sight, watching the things that were done, beat on their breasts and turned and went away. And all his acquaintance, his friends, the women that followed him from Galilee, stood way off, watching everything. You have to wonder at that time what was going through their minds, what they were thinking, what had happened to their hope and their dreams concerning this man. Because it's very clear, not one of them, I think, understood at all that Jesus had told them this had to happen, and that he made it clear he was going to have to be raised from the dead. You don't get the feeling of anticipation, only of grief. There was a man named Joseph, a counselor, a good man, just. The same had not consented to the counsel of the deed of them. He was one of the big guys in Jerusalem, but he did not agree with what they were doing. He was of Arimathea, a city of the Jews. He also waited for the kingdom of God. He went to Pilate and begged the body of Jesus, and he took it down, wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a sepulchre that was cut in stone, wherein man had never been laid. Now, the other Gospels tell us it had to be done quickly because the Sabbath was drawing on, and there was no time. The idea of a Friday crucifixion hangs on this one verse, that actually on one word. That day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. Now, the question is, what did he mean by that? The preparation day, customarily, is a Friday because of the weekly Sabbath. That's the way it is, right on down the line. But is that what this is talking about? It says the women also that came with him from Galilee followed after him, and they looked at the sepulchre and saw how his body was laid. And they went back and prepared spices and ointments and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Now, what is odd about this is, they watched Jesus laid in the tomb just as the Sabbath was beginning. How did they find the time in there to prepare the spices before the Sabbath started? Because that was work. They would not have done that on the Sabbath. Now, if you compare this with Mark 16:1, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome had bought sweet spices that they might come and anoint him. Now, the King James boys are trying to reconcile this with what they think happened. The NIV, though, gets it right. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Okay? The preparation had to follow the purchase. If you go buy the spices, then you get them ready. You don't get them ready and then go buy them, do you? This happened after the Sabbath, not before. Now, how do you reconcile these two? Well, if the Sabbath following Jesus' death was on a Thursday, the first day of the feast, which was also a Sabbath day, then you have 2 Sabbaths that week with a day in between. The women came, watched Joseph of Arimathea put Jesus in the tomb, and the stone was rolled across it. And they went home. When the Sabbath was past, they went out and bought spices and prepared them, and then rested on the weekly Sabbath day which followed. That's the simple reconciliation of it, and it solves another problem. Now you don't have to try to figure out how you get 3 days and 3 nights from Friday sunset to Sunday morning. You've got a Wednesday crucifixion and burial. Thursday is a Sabbath. Friday is not a Sabbath. You can work. Saturday is the Sabbath. And at the end of that Sabbath, Jesus opened his eyes and walked out of the tomb. Now we will follow next week into the Luke 24, the last chapter of this gospel, and with some of the lessons that we can pull together from all this that's happened. Shirley Peoples writes from Arizona. She says, "It appears to me that the Christian church is so divided in what it believes." No kidding, it really is. I started out a Methodist, 2 Pentecostal, 2 non-denominational, until I started attending my recent church, going on 7 years now, and started listening to you, going on 6 years now. I didn't realize how divided we are in how we interpret the Bible. For example, my sister attends a Pentecostal church. They bring in pastors that have the gift of healing, and when they have their services, people come in droves to be healed, and he or she touches everyone, and many times quite a large number of them fall down and are taken in the Spirit. I don't understand this at all. Well, I can understand why you wouldn't, Shirley, because there is really nothing like this in the Bible. I haven't seen it myself, but I've heard people describe what happened. Benny Hinn walking down, he came carrying his jacket over his shoulder, and he reached out and flicks it toward the crowd who's standing with his jacket. It hits the first person in line. He goes down, and a whole row of people fall on the ground. I think I've heard that called being slain in the Spirit. Now, I don't know how this phenomenon of people falling down got started. I don't recall that happening in any of Jesus' healings, nor those of Peter or any of the others. In fact, Peter sees a guy sitting on the ground, says, "Rise up and walk. Get up, not fall down." If you would really want to get a rundown on the origins of this, Pam Dewey has an excellent website at www.isitso.org. It's searchable. She's got a good search engine, and you can find a lot of information there. You want to enter speaking in tongues, it'll take you there. If you want to talk about slain in the Spirit, it'll take you there. Now, some people think this falling down is demonic, and in some cases it just might be. But I think it's just as likely to be a reaction of the emotions of the moment in a highly suggestible people, and I think some people fall down because they think they are supposed to. I do not think it's a manifestation of the Holy Spirit, in that there is no biblical precedent for it. It happens, and I would not like to be there when it does. Shirley goes on. Another lady who really loves the Lord and leads a ministry group has women who come to her for prayer regarding tough issues they are facing. She is not sure how to pray with them or what to pray for, so she tells them she will pray with them in tongues. She will sit with them and pray for them in tongues. I don't understand this either. Can you shed some light on these issues? Well, most of this arises from a misinterpretation and a misconception of 1 Corinthians chapter 14. Writing to the Corinthians, Paul has heard about something going on there. First of all, let's understand this. And we are reading someone else's mail, and so it's not always easy to understand exactly what Paul is saying, but we'll just read and see what he has to say. Paul says, follow the way of love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts, especially the gift of prophecy. This is the NIV version. Now, I want to emphasize that when he speaks of prophecy, the way he uses the term, he's not talking about telling us, what's going to happen in the future in 1,290 days or 1,360 days. It's not that kind of prophecy. It's not talking about a seer. Prophecy in this sense means speaking under inspiration. In other words, God inspires a man and he gets up there and preaches. He says, anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God. Indeed, no one understands him. He's uttering mysteries with his spirit. Now, what's he saying here? First of all, Paul wasn't there, I think, when this began to happen, and he's heard about it. He knows about Acts 2. And what is odd about this is that the manifestation of tongues in Acts 2 is not a gift of unknown tongues. They are named languages. I'll let you take the time to go back and read Acts 2 again. It will tell you the names of the tongues they were speaking. They were named, known languages, and they were given the gift of these languages so that people who didn't speak Greek or Hebrew could hear the gospel. Paul knew that. He had a full understanding of it. In fact, the indications are he had a gift of his own to speak to people in different languages. He was multilingual. So he understood this. So what's happening in Corinth? Well, we're reading someone else's mail. Paul assumes a knowledge of the questions he has been asked. In some cases, he cites what the Corinthians were arguing, and then he responds to it. Take verse 2 as a case in point. It may be not an advocacy of this or that, but a description of what Paul had heard was happening. Listen, anyone who speaks in a language is not speaking to men, but to God, because nobody there understands him. He utters mysteries with his spirit. Well, is that possible that someone had come up there from Africa who stood up and spoke to the congregation in some Libyan dialect that nobody in the congregation even understood, but they let him speak? Maybe. Our problem arises, again, we're reading someone else's mail. The Corinthians knew what the framework was for it. I gather Paul, as I said, was not there when it started. I've also heard that non-Christian speaking in unknown tongues was known among the pagan Greeks. I hadn't realized that till I started researching this thing. But glossolalia, or speaking in what sounds like language, but has no meaning to it, was really not unknown. Paul now argues for the precedence of preaching over babblings that no one understands. You follow me? He's arguing that it's far better for somebody to stand up here and preach in a language we all understand than to babble in a language nobody understands. He says, everyone who prophesies or preaches speaks to men for their strengthening, encouragement, and comfort. He who speaks in a tongue edifies himself. He who prophesies edifies the church. That's an important distinction here. Speaking in tongues, according to Paul, is self-oriented. It also suggests that the one speaking in tongues at least knows what he is saying. To me, the idea that my tongue would be uttering words that I do not understand is frightening to me. Who knows what I'd be saying, and whether or not the Spirit that's come my way is of God or not? The Bible says, don't just believe the spirits, try the spirits. How do you try the spirits? The only way I know to try them is by the Bible. Okay. Paul then goes on to say, I would like that every one of you speak in a language, but I would rather have you preach. He who preaches is greater than the one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets so the church may be edified. The purpose of speaking, then, whether it's a foreign language or not, is communication. That's the message of this chapter. Now, brothers, if I come to you and speak in tongues, what good will I be to you unless I bring you some revelation or knowledge or prophecy or word of instruction? What's the point unless I'm communicating something? Speaking in tongues is pointless unless it's understood. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying here, whatever else you may want to interpret of his words. Even in the case of lifeless things that make sound, such as a flute or a harp, how do we know what tune is being played unless the notes are different? Well, how indeed, when you think about it. How can you tell whether he's playing reveille or taps unless there's a distinction between them? And he actually uses an example. If the trumpet doesn't sound a clear call, who's going to get ready for battle? It's that way with you. Unless you speak intelligible words with your tongue, how will anyone know what you are saying? You will just be speaking into the air. You want to know what Paul thinks about speaking in tongues? If they're unknown tongues, you're just speaking into the air. He goes on in verse 10 to say, undoubtedly there are all sorts of languages in the world, yet none of them is without meaning. And meaning is the crucial thing, and this is so hard to get through people's heads. It's why Paul warned against strifes of words when he wrote one of his epistles, is that it is not the word that's important, it's what the word means that's important. And sometimes that's determined by the context. And Paul says, if I don't grasp the meaning of what somebody's saying, I am a foreigner to the speaker, and he's a foreigner to me, and so it is with you. Paul, candidly, seems to me to be dissing speaking in tongues. Now, since you're eager to have spiritual gifts, try to excel in gifts that build up the church. For this reason, anyone who speaks in a tongue should pray that he may interpret what he says. For if I pray in a language, my spirit prays, but my mind is unfruitful. So what shall I do? I will pray with my spirit. I will also pray with my mind. I will sing with my spirit. I will also sing with my mind. Paul is saying clearly, I will speak a language, but I will also have my mind involved in this. I will know what the message is. I will know what I'm saying. Now, I don't take this as an advocacy of speaking in tongues and not understanding what you are saying. If you're praising God, Paul said, with your spirit, how can one find himself among those who do not understand, say amen at your thanksgiving, since he doesn't know what you're talking about? You may give thanks well enough, but the other man is not edified, not educated. No communication takes place. Now, I thank God I speak in languages more than any of you. I think what he's saying is he's multilingual, not that he speaks out gibberish in the middle of a sermon. Because he goes on to say, in the church I would rather speak 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a language that's foreign here. Now, does that give perspective to the issue or not? I think it does. And he says, now, brothers, stop thinking like children. It's childish, he says. In regard to evil, be infants, but in your thinking, grow up, be adults. In the law it is written, through men of strange tongues and through the lips of foreigners I will speak to this people. But even then they will not listen to me, says the Lord. You go back and look that up in the Old Testament, and you'll find what he's saying is that he speaks to them this way so they won't understand. Tongues, then, are a sign not for believers but for unbelievers. Prophecy isn't for believers, not unbelievers. So, if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, and someone comes in that doesn't understand, or some unbelievers come in, they're going to say you're out of your mind. But if an unbeliever or someone who does not understand comes in while everybody is prophesying or preaching, he will be convinced by all that he's a sinner and be judged, and the secrets of his heart will be laid bare, and he will fall down and worship God, explaining God really is among you. What causes that to happen? Speaking in tongues? Nope. Prophesying in a language the man understands. So what shall we say, brothers? Well, when you come together, everyone has a hymn, a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or an interpretation. All these have to be done for the strengthening of the church. If anyone speaks in a language, 2 or the most 3 should speak, 1 at a time, and somebody must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet in the church and speak to himself and to God. No interpreter? Shut up. Now, out of this has come, the spiritual gift of interpreting of tongues, and you will have some guys stand up and speak in tongues, and some guy will stand up and interpret it. Some researchers decided they would find out about this, so they recorded several people speaking in tongues. And they went to some people who claimed to have the gift of interpretation. and they play this for them, and they would hear it and give them the interpretation. What they found fascinating was everything went on with great fluence, both the speaking in tongues and the interpretation. But no two interpreters agreed on what the person originally had been saying. When they pointed him out to him, they didn't mind. It was not important because God gave me a different interpretation of what he had to say than he did this other guy. I mean, you can't win in that kind of a discussion with people, and you're better off turning around and walking away from it. Paul said, let's hear a person speak, and let's don't waste a lot of time at it. Don't let him go on and on. If there's an interpreter, let him speak and let him interpret what he said. If there's no interpreter, he should keep quiet and speak to himself, to God. And this interpretation has to be objective. In other words, if I'm speaking French, we need to give somebody who gives you the message in English exactly like I spoke it in French. 2 or 3 prophets should speak. The other should weigh carefully what is said. If a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop and let the other one speak. For you can all prophesy in turn, that everyone can be instructed and encouraged. Then he says something kind of odd. He said the spirits are subject to the control of the prophets. You know what that means? It means you can never do something impulsively and claim, well, the Spirit made me do it. The Spirit doesn't make you do anything. The spirits of the prophets are subject to the prophets. God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. Later in verse 39, he says, therefore, my brothers, be eager to prophesy and do not forbid speaking in tongues, but everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. This is where all this stuff comes from, and I think there have been a lot of inventions that people have made growing out of an idiosyncratic interpretation of what Paul wrote to the Corinthians when they don't even know for sure the context in which they were made. Actually, I have a couple more questions, but I think I'm going to hold them over to next week. So be sure and get your study in and be back with us next week, and send your questions to me at ron@borntowin.net. I'm Ronald Dart, and you were born to win.